Welcome to another one of our talks. I think this is actually my first talk, although, yeah, myself, Shangyun, and Daniela were the team doing this project. So, with my brief presentation, the idea is to kind of complement Daniela's presentation in some way with a kind of twist toward questions of ecology and sustainability, and specifically riffing off of Daniela's starting points into um, the kind of combination of net art or yeah participatory art on the internet and collaborative social practice. So for starters, just as a bit of context on why we're talking about sustainability here. Um, so it might seem to the, well, more or less uninitiated in, say, climate politics, policy, environmental policy more broadly, that all the ecological problematique is very clear cut with very clear cut policies, etc., to address them. Whereas the reality might be somewhat different, specifically in that um, discourses around ecology, sustainability, and the kind of interventions, new models of economy, etc., that would be required to address this crisis are far from not contested. Um, so we're essentially living in a time that we could mark as a kind of post-political time when it comes to climate politics, in the sense that there is a kind of pervasive hegemonic discourse around green growth and green capitalism, which kind of drives current policy and is kind of contributing rather than alleviating the crisis. And the purpose of this presentation here is to go a little bit more deep into what the role of, let's say, net art in a kind of, let's say, loose definition, or taking some liberties with it, or maybe echoing what the iconoclastistas Daniela mentioned could be a definition or role of net art. And more broadly, I suppose we're talking about participatory art platforms, open platforms, civic platforms, and also we will touch upon games and gaming as a kind of form of civic engagement around sustainability issues. And specifically, yeah, we will discuss how these kinds of platforms, protocols, games can be used to empower more grassroots concepts around sustainability, such as degrowth or post-growth discourses, or discourses around social environmental justice. And so, yeah, just to briefly outline the rest of this presentation, we will touch upon just a few examples of such platforms, and then we will move on to a kind of prototypical kind of game slash platform that I myself have been developing for the past year or two in this direction, and hopefully kind of illuminate a, let's say, a new potentiality or a new potential space or applications of net art, participatory art in this context. Uh, could I ask for the next slide, please? Okay, so for the kind of first example, we'll be loosely kind of referencing throughout this wonderful book by T.J. Demos called Decolonizing Nature. Specifically, maybe if we can go to the next slide, specifically the World of Matter platform. So essentially, yeah, can we go to the next slide? The World of Matter project is a kind of collaborative platform as Daniela also mentioned in the other presentation, kind of trying to go beyond disciplinary boundaries, also kind of embodying a more participatory practice, and also a kind of online mapping of, uh, yeah, on the one hand, say, an analysis of the present, a critical analysis of both environmental struggles and workers' struggles who are kind of engaged in questions of environment or uh, and the like. And on the other hand, the platform kind of maps or engages speculative models of alternative possible worlds. And how they do this is combining, well, different approaches, yeah, containing video uh, or audio approaches like soundscaping to, yeah, text-based displays, cartographic analyses, sculpture, and interestingly mixed media installations, including internet installations. And one of the kind of specific aims is to provide a new media ecology, a kind of transdisciplinary and collaborative practice around ecological issues. So one of the key concepts that I would like to highlight as part of this example and the examples that will follow is the notion of knowledge commons. So the idea of one of the central ideas of this platform is to offer is both the platform itself being a kind of a knowledge commons, so open access, free for all platform, but is also dedicated to the production of knowledge commons, both by experts and lay alike, and kind of forming transdisciplinary communities of practice. Um, so yeah, both the commons, material and immaterial. I suppose at this point we will not go so much into the definition of commons, although that's a quite interesting talk in of itself. But as of late, specifically maybe in the last few decades, it has also risen as a kind of counter-hegemonic discourse, also in the ecological sphere, and also the notion of commoning as a kind of practice of creating commons. If I can go to the next slide. Okay, so we'll move on to which is perhaps more my domain, which is yeah, games, net-based games or other types of games as public participation platforms. So the kind of thesis that I've been working with, again, kind of loosely based on you could say the iconoclastistas definition of net art in terms of the neo-media nature of it and its objective. So creating a public space on the internet for community exchange and essentially generating, you can say, a transformative knowledge commons. And specifically in the area of ecology, kind of, yeah, both using these kind of platforms, both questioning the hegemonic growth based narrative and generating new narratives, imaginaries, but also mapping initiatives that could be construed as, let's say, seeds of alternative worlds that are possible. One of the central tenets of such designs is or would be essentially the democratization of futures making, of world making, if you like. Mm. And yeah, some of these examples would be these so-called social innovation, socio-ecological innovation maps or mappings, both done by high budget kind of research institutions, but more interestingly, more grassroots based initiatives, um, and also delve a little bit into potentialities in terms of how mappings or collaborative generation of experiential futures or alternative presents or alternative worlds um, could constitute a kind of transformative practice in of itself. And we'll be thinking a little bit about the affordances of internet specifically to facilitate that. Next slide, please. So one of the more visible grassroots examples of collaborative mapping of alternatives is so-called transfer map. It is very much associated with people active in the kind of commons discourse, specifically Silke Helfrich and a few other more prominent authors in the field. And essentially, the idea here is to develop different parameters as a community to map, yeah, different initiatives corresponding maybe to food, technology, housing, what have you, that might be construed as prefigurations of alternative possible worlds, economies, modes of politics, and so on. Other maybe prominent examples could be seeds of good Anthropocenes. There is also an initiative called Transformative Cities and the Atlas of Utopias. These are all kind of online databases, uh, collaborative databases, in the sense that all kinds of initiatives from around the world can submit themselves as examples and are mapped on these collective maps. Specifically, Transform Map aims to be kind of a map of maps in this respect. Next slide, please. And delving into more like experimental or potentialities territory, I wanted to highlight one example, which is the Open Futures Library. At this point, it's more like a proof of concept rather than a fully fledged platform with a very active global community, although that certainly was and still is the goal of the platform. But the idea is essentially to use the affordances of the internet and collaboration, distributed collaboration, to kind of upload, so to say, different visions, scenarios of futures, be it produced through, again, a big budget kind of research initiatives, even companies, but also to various grassroots initiatives kind of articulating alternative futures and developing as a kind of collaborative online community different tags and other tools that enable the searching for different scenarios based on different parameters, again, such as food, energy, housing, etc. And again, this being perhaps one prefiguration of example or of kind of a foresight knowledge commons, a kind of platform for producing and for people to access different ideas and resources related to envisioning, imagining alternative futures. Next slide, please. Okay, so Game Changers the Game is kind of the, I suppose, last example that I would like to show, and this is, as mentioned, one of my personal projects here. One of the reasons why I also lean on one of my own projects is because up until now I haven't really found any kind of games or platforms that specifically address the discursive contestation of sustainability or different notions of sustainability. And would like to just highlight some basic tenets of this game and kind of the kind of imagined upscaled version. It is available online privately for the moment. It was first construed as a kind of board game that also includes elements of public participation in terms of creating, curating different content that can then be included in the next iterations of the game. And yeah, one of the basic tenets, not yet, thank you, is there are two teams who are kind of fighting one against the other. One team being capitalism or neoliberalism, so this kind of hegemonic narrative of green capitalism, a kind of posited against, so a kind of versus degrowth or commons narratives. And the idea is to kind of play with these dynamics that we can see where capitalism uses, co-opts different initiatives, different new concepts that arise for its own purposes, versus yeah, how degrowth and commons try to more horizontally, more like kind of mycelium network or something like this, combine different initiatives and kind of potentiate their transformative power. Next slide. So as said, this is kind of in a prototypical stage with kind of various playtests going on around Europe mostly. So this is one of the playtests done in the Netherlands at the Dutch Research Institute for Transition. This was in 2019, before the kind of COVID epidemic hit, and partly because of the pandemic, but also before that, I created an online version of the game as well. Next slide, please. And as stated, through the game, players kind of engage in different narratives related to sustainability. These days, we hear a lot about, for example, circular sharing economy, smart cities, post-carbon economies, collaborative governance, regenerative economies, and so forth. And the idea is that players here are challenged to, yeah, lay claim or to these narratives in two teams. And yeah, that's essentially one of the main mechanics of the game. So trying to win over to your side these narratives. And the way you do this is by combining different prompt cards. One of the specifics of this game or would-be platform is also the how to say, well, the openness, the malleability of the content that is being played with. So for example, these concepts, notions are interchangeable. Players can configure them themselves and kind of determine which concepts they would like to play with. These are not necessarily just the ones that we see on the screen right now, but can also correspond to more local specific narratives that are salient or are gaining either through grassroots or top down some kind of power in terms of like the overall discourse about where the society is going or should be going. Next slide, please. So one of the main mechanics, as said, is using different prompt cards, and players are challenged to essentially combine them in specific areas corresponding to the different narratives of new economy and sustainability. One set of these cards are challenge cards, which are opposed by capitalism as challenges in these specific so-called transition arenas. And well, these challenge cards are essentially generated based on a literature overview, interviews with different scholars, practitioners, and communities. But there is also kind of crowdsourcing element to it. So people can submit their own challenges to, let's say, radical change as they see them, and they can become part of the game. They can become prompts for other players around the world to create stories. One of the aims is also, once these stories are made, they can also be shared with the global community. Next slide. Those were some examples of challenges, and the same kind of methodology applies to the interventions. So say we are a player of degrowth or commons, and we land on a field that is already co-opted by capitalism. Let's say that we land on the area designated as universal basic income, which we could say in these times is quite a contested term. Yeah, and universal basic incomes are not one and the same. It depends on who is discussing and what kind of model is implied by that name. And so, yeah, again, a mapping of different possible interventions that individuals or communities around the world either have used or think could have big transformative potential. Players are invited to, yeah, match an intervention with a challenge in this specific, let's say in this case, universal basic income, and they are challenged to create a storyline in about 1 minute, and it's up to the rest of the players to kind of assess that storyline's plausibility and inventiveness. Plausibility kind of being a rather controversial, let's say, epistemological category when it comes to conceptualizing change. And as such, it is kind of complemented with this notion of inventiveness, because, well, a lot of times, especially in policy discourse and future scenarios, this kind of, let's say, European Union or other kind of intergovernmental levels, uh, these plausibility is kind of limits the range of possibility, you could say. So players kind of assess this, and that determines essentially the success rate of the strategy. And if it succeeds, then the team kind of has successfully won over to their side these concepts. Uh, Whereas if not, these strategies can backfire, meaning that a narrative can even become locked out forever from being able to be won over by either side. And so to get back to kind of the main point and the participatory art angle. So as said, these examples are kind of perhaps stretching the category of net art, although as we've discussed in other presentations, the definition itself, we could say, is kind of murky and open to, different branchings and evolutions. Uh, but with this, brief presentation and these examples, I wish to show kind of the potentiality space of and affordances of internet-based communication and collaboration, and essentially creating interventions into hegemonic discourse, and perhaps, creating new spaces and ways of transforming these discursive spaces um, towards, more progressive concepts or interpretations of salient or mainstream concepts. So with that, I will leave uh, some room for additional questions and dialogue between us on how we can see all these different examples contributing to broader, exciting definitions of net art and its potentialities.